Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The evening breeze carried the scent of burning firewood and roasted corn, blending with the distant sounds of laughter from neighbors gathered outside. Grace sat on the small wooden bench in front of Ace's one-room apartment, her arms folded across her chest as she stared into the darkness. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling inside flickered weakly, barely illuminating the cracked walls and the worn-out furniture. Ace sat beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers intertwined. He looked tired, more tired than usual. His shirt, though neatly tucked in, had lost its original color from years of washing. His shoes, the same pair he had worn since she met him, had visible cracks along the edges. It wasn't that Grace didn't love him, she did, or at least she believed she did, but love had started to feel like a burden, like something that weighed heavily on her chest whenever she thought of the future. Ace was a good man, kind and hard-working, but no matter how hard he worked, nothing seemed to change. His dreams were big, but his reality was small, and she was beginning to wonder if love alone could fill the emptiness she felt inside. "One day, things will be different," Ace said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need time." He turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance, for hope. Grace swallowed, forcing a small smile as she reached for his hand. It was rough, calloused from years of manual labor, yet warm and familiar. "I know," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She wanted to believe him, she truly did, but doubt had begun to creep into her mind like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't just about money. It was about the life she saw slipping away while she waited for a change that never seemed to come. Their conversations had become repetitive, the same promises, the same reassurances, yet nothing ever truly changed. The weight of survival pressed on them every day, forcing her to question whether love was enough to endure the hunger, the unpaid bills, the constant worrying about what tomorrow would bring. Ace had dreams of leaving the country, of making something of himself, but dreams didn't put food on the table. Dreams didn't pay rent. Dreams didn't stop the gnawing feeling of regret that had begun to settle in her heart. That night, as she lay beside Ace on the thin mattress that barely cushioned them from the hard floor, she listened to his steady breathing and felt a lump rise in her throat. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of it made her stomach twist. Love wasn't supposed to feel this heavy. She wanted to believe that if she just held on a little longer, things would change, but deep down, she was tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of hoping. Tired of loving someone whose love felt like a battle against life itself. She turned on her side, her back facing Ace, as she squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear slipped down her cheek, disappearing into the pillow. She told herself that leaving him didn't mean she didn't love him. It only meant she loved herself enough to choose a different path. But in the quiet of the night, as the weight of her decision settled over her, she couldn't help but wonder, was she making the right choice, or was she about to make the biggest mistake of her life? The day Grace left Ace, the sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of rain, as if the universe itself disapproved of her decision. She didn't tell him outright that she was leaving. Instead, she started with small, careful steps, pulling away little by little, reducing the frequency of her visits, responding to his messages later than usual, letting silence stretch between them until it became unbearable. At first, Ace noticed but said nothing. Perhaps he assumed she was going through something and would return when she was ready. But as the days turned into weeks, he confronted her, his voice laced with desperation and confusion. "Grace, what's going on? Talk to me." She had no real answer to give him, nothing that would make it hurt any less. She simply told him what she had been telling herself for weeks. "I need something more, Ace. I can't keep waiting for a future that may never come." He stared at her for a long time, his jaw tight, His hands clenched at his sides as if he wanted to hold on to her, but knew she had already slipped away. Then he nodded once, slowly, and without another word, turned and walked away. That was the last time she saw him. At first, leaving felt like freedom. Grace threw herself into her job at the small boutique where she worked, smiling at customers, laughing with her coworkers, and convincing herself she had made the right decision. She allowed herself to go out more, to be around people who didn't remind her of the struggle she had left behind. She even started dating again, letting herself be taken to nice restaurants, eating meals she never could have afforded when she was with Ease. It was a different life, easier, lighter, free from the weight of constant worry. But sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in her small apartment, she would lie awake and wonder if Ease was eating well, if he had finally gotten that job he always talked about, if he ever thought about her the way she still, despite everything, thought about him. She told herself it was just nostalgia, that she wasn't regretting her choice, but the ache in her chest said otherwise. And then one day she heard the news. Ease had left the country. The words hit her like a blow to the stomach. He had done it. He had finally found a way out. While she had been busy trying to move on, he had been working towards the future he had always promised. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside her: pride, relief, and something she wasn't ready to admit felt a lot like regret. She wanted to know how he had managed it, where he had gone, what he was doing. But most of all, she wanted to talk to him, to hear his voice again, to know if he had moved on as well. Against her better judgment, she picked up her phone and typed out a message. "Hey, it's been a while. I heard you left. I hope you're doing well." She stared at the screen for a long time before finally pressing send. A part of her expected him to ignore her, but when her phone vibrated minutes later with his response, her heart raced in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "Grace, it really has been a while. I'm doing great. How are you?" And just like that, the door she thought had closed forever was open again. At first, their conversations were light, almost hesitant, as if they were both testing the waters. Grace and Ease exchanged pleasantries, asking about work, the weather, and mutual acquaintances they had long left behind. But beneath the surface of their carefully chosen words, there was something deeper, an unspoken history that lingered between them, threatening to rise to the surface at any moment. Ease told her about his new life abroad, how different everything was, how the streets were clean, the air crisp, the opportunities endless. There was a pride in his voice that made Grace's chest tighten, not with jealousy, but with something more complicated. She was happy for him, truly, but she couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of her mind whispering, "This could have been your life, too, if only you had waited." She didn't voice this thought, of course. Instead, she laughed at his stories, nodded along when he spoke about his plans, and pretended that everything between them was as simple as two old friends catching up. But then, one evening, after weeks of casual conversations, Ease finally asked the question that had been hanging between them like a ghost. "Do you ever think about us, Grace?" The words stopped her breath. She had been sitting on her bed, her phone in her hand, the dim glow of her bedside lamp casting soft shadows on the wall. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed out her response. "I do." She hesitated, then added, "More than I should." It was the truth. She had spent countless nights replaying their past, wondering if she had made the right choice, if she had been too impatient, if she had given up on something that could have been beautiful. Ease's response came quickly. "Me too." And just like that, something shifted between them. The casual conversations turned into late-night calls. The laughter became softer, more intimate. They reminisced about their time together, about the nights they spent sitting outside his apartment, dreaming about the future, about the way he used to hold her when the world felt too heavy. It felt familiar, like slipping into an old, well-worn sweater, but it also felt dangerous, because deep down, Grace knew that nostalgia had a way of making the past seem sweeter than it really was. Then one night, Eve said the words she never expected to hear. "I want to marry you, Grace." Her heart stopped, her mind racing to catch up. He continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've thought about this for a long time. I know things didn't work out before, but maybe they were supposed to happen this way. Maybe we're meant to find each other again now that I can finally give you the life you deserve." Grace felt her chest tighten. This was everything she had once wanted, to be with ease, to share in his success, to have a future with the man she had loved for so long. And yet, something about it felt too easy, too perfect, as if they were trying to rewrite a story that had already been written. But before she could voice her doubts, before she could even fully process what was happening, Ease continued. "There's just one thing, Grace. Before we get married, I need to be sure of something." She frowned. "Sure of what?" His next words sent a chill down her spine. "I need to know that you can give me a child. I need you to get pregnant first." Grace stared at her phone screen, rereading Isa's words over and over again, as if they would change if she looked long enough. "I need you to get pregnant first." The message sent a cold shiver down her spine, yet her fingers trembled as she typed out a response. "Pregnant? Why?" Her heart pounded as she waited for his reply, her mind already filling with 1,000 explanations, each more unsettling than the last. When his response finally came, it was calm, almost logical. "I just want to be sure, Grace. I don't want to take any chances. Fertility issues are a big deal, and I've seen too many marriages crumble because of it. I love you, and I want us to start a family without doubts." The words felt rehearsed, but she couldn't deny that they made sense. She had heard stories of women struggling to conceive, of men who left because of it. Maybe Ease was just being cautious. Maybe this was his way of ensuring their future was secure. But something about it still felt wrong. She chewed on her lower lip, her thoughts spiraling in a direction she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. "But you're not here, Ease. How am I supposed to get pregnant if you're not here?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and loaded with unspoken implications. Then came his response, simple but devastating. "Find someone else. It doesn't matter how. Just get pregnant. Once you do, I'll come back, marry you, and take you with me." Grace felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She sat frozen, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. He couldn't be serious. He couldn't expect her to do that. Her stomach twisted at the thought, but then another feeling crept in, desperation. The idea of marrying Ease, of finally leaving behind the life she had fought so hard to escape, dangled in front of her like a golden ticket. Could she really say no? Wasn't this what she had always wanted? Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, but before she could talk herself out of it, she typed the one word that sealed her fate. Okay. The moment she pressed send, nausea rolled through her, but it was too late. She had made her choice. The days that followed were a blur of conflicted emotions. Grace tried to reason with herself, telling herself it was just a means to an end. If she could get through this, she would have everything she had ever dreamed of: a husband, stability, a new life in a new country. But the reality of what she had agreed to was heavier than she had anticipated. Every time she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized. And then came the night when she finally forced herself to go through with it. Dressed in a tight black dress that clung to her body, she stepped into the dimly lit club, her heart pounding against her ribs. The music was loud, the air thick with smoke and sweat. Men's eyes roamed over her as she walked past, but she felt nothing but numbness. When a stranger approached her, his breath laced with alcohol, his hand brushing against her waist, she forced herself to smile. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn around and leave, but her body betrayed her. She had made a promise, to Ease, to herself. And so, she let herself fall. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of cheap cologne and alcohol. Grace sat on the edge of the motel bed, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress as if holding onto it would stop the inevitable. The man she had picked up at the club was in the bathroom, humming some off-key tune as he washed up. She barely remembered his name, didn't even care to ask for it again. Everything about this felt wrong, but she had already come too far. Backing out now would mean facing an emptiness she wasn't sure she could bear. She had convinced herself that this was nothing more than a step toward the future she wanted, a means to an end. And yet, as she sat there, waiting, her skin crawled with the weight of what she was about to do. She thought of Ease, of the love they once shared, of the words he had whispered to her over the phone. "This is for us, Grace. Just do this, and everything will be fine." But would it? Could she really erase this night from her mind once it was over? The bathroom door creaked open, and the man emerged, wiping his face with a towel, his gaze settling on her with an expectation that made her stomach turn. She swallowed hard, forcing her body to move, even as every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. She left the motel before dawn, the city still asleep, the streets empty except for the occasional stray dog or street vendor setting up for the morning rush. The air was crisp, but no amount of cold could wash away the filth she felt clinging to her skin. She walked quickly, head down, hands shoved into the pockets of her jacket, as if that could shield her from the shame pressing down on her chest. By the time she reached her apartment, she felt like she was suffocating. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she collapsed onto the floor, her body racked with silent sobs. She had done it. It was over. But instead of relief, all she felt was an overwhelming sense of loss, like she had given away a piece of herself she could never get back. Days passed in a blur after that. She went to work, smiled when required, spoke only when necessary. But inside, she was unraveling. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back, a woman she no longer recognized. And then, weeks later, the nausea began, the dizziness, the exhaustion that clung to her like a heavy blanket. She didn't need a test to tell her what she already knew. She was pregnant. Heimat, Frangenatum, Feisen Matters of Pregnante, Almestes, Rashis meant Enfys. Pregnant. Pregnant to this busting sortion matron for to this pregnant. Solved postal was pregnant, and the bigness to the authority. Fragment chaven deseches is bagnatis, fragmentis. Pulsives pregnant. She was pregnant. Factions. Her hands trembled as she held the phone, staring at his name on the screen. This was it, at the moment that would change everything. With a deep breath, she dialed his number, pressing the phone tightly against her ear as it rang. He answered on the third ring, his voice smooth, expectant. "Grace?" She swallowed past a lump in her throat, forcing herself to speak. "I'm pregnant." For a moment there was only silence, then a deep exhale from the other end, and then laughter. Not mocking, not cruel, just pure, unfiltered happiness. "Grace, you did it. You really did it." The warmth in his voice sent a strange mix of relief and unease through her. He was happy. That was all that mattered, wasn't it? "I told you everything would be fine," he continued. "I'll be back when you're 7 months gone. Just hold on a little longer." His words should have soothed her, but instead they settled over her like a heavy weight. She had done everything he asked, and yet something inside her whispered that this wasn't the end of her suffering. It was only the beginning. The days after Grace confirmed her pregnancy stretched into weeks, then months, each one carrying a weight she hadn't anticipated. At first, she clung to the hope that everything would soon fall into place. She told herself that Iz's return would make it all worthwhile, that once he came back, all the shame and guilt would fade, replaced by the happiness of the life he had promised her. But as the weeks passed, she found herself trapped in an uneasy silence. E still called, still sent messages, but something about his tone had changed. The warmth was still there, But now it felt distant, like he was speaking from another world she couldn't reach. Whenever she brought up his return, he reassured her. Soon, Grace. Just hold on a little longer. But soon began to feel like a word without meaning, a promise stretched too thin. She tried to push the doubts away, to focus on the life growing inside her, but the uncertainty gnawed at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. Her belly swelled with each passing month, a constant reminder of the choice she had made. The sickness had faded, replaced by an exhaustion that weighed down her bones. Her body was changing in ways she wasn't ready for, her reflection becoming a stranger she could barely recognize. The few friends she had noticed a shift in her, their questions hovering just below the surface. "Grace, you've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" She would force a smile, nod, change the subject. She couldn't tell them the truth, couldn't bear to see the judgment in their eyes. So she carried the weight alone, waiting for the day when everything would finally make sense. But as the 7th month approached, the silence from Ease grew louder. His calls became less frequent, his responses delayed. And when she finally gathered the courage to ask, "Ease, are you really coming back?" his hesitation stretched longer than she could bear. Then came the night everything shattered. She lay in bed, her phone clutched in her hands, waiting for his usual call. But when the phone finally rang, the voice on the other end was not the man she had once loved. It was someone colder, detached. "Grace, you haven't changed," Ease said, his tone laced with something she couldn't quite place. Her breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Silence stretched between them before he spoke again, slow and deliberate. "You agreed too easily, Grace. You didn't even hesitate. How could I ever trust someone who would do this?" The room spun around her, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Ease, you told me to." "I know what I said," he cut in. "And you did exactly what I expected. But did you ever stop to think why I asked?" A bitter laugh followed, sharp and cruel. "This was never about trust, Grace. This was payback for leaving me when I had nothing." The words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her fingers went numb around the phone. He continued, his voice devoid of the love he once professed. "I could never marry someone who would carry another man's child so easily. You made your choice, and now you'll live with it. I'm done, Grace. Goodbye." The line went dead, leaving only the hollow sound of her own breath. And in that moment, as the weight of his betrayal crashed over her, she realized she had lost everything. The phone slipped from Grace's trembling fingers, landing on the cold floor with a soft thud. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to process the words that had just shattered the last remnants of her hope. This was payback. The phrase echoed in her head, looping like a cruel melody. Ease had never intended to return. He had never planned to marry her. Every whispered promise, every reassurance, had been nothing more than a carefully laid trap, one she had walked into blindly. A sick, twisting feeling settled in her stomach as the truth fully sank in. He had wanted revenge for the day she left him, for the pain she had caused him when he had nothing. And now he had left her with something she could never undo. Her body felt heavy, as if the weight of her choices had finally pressed down on her all at once. She tried to move, to breathe, to cry, but nothing came. Only silence. Only the deafening emptiness of a future that had crumbled before her eyes. The days that followed blurred into one another, each one stretching endlessly, filled only with the quiet hum of regret. Grace barely ate. Sleep became a fleeting luxury, stolen only in brief, restless intervals. She ignored the concerned calls from her co-workers, avoided the curious stares of neighbors who had begun to notice the change in her. The world outside continued to move, oblivious to the storm that raged inside her. The baby inside her, innocent and unaware, continued to grow, a constant reminder of the choices she had made, of the man who had used her pain against her. She found herself replaying their conversations in her mind, dissecting every word, searching for the moment she could have stopped this from happening. But there was no moment, no single decision that had led her here. It had all been a slow unraveling, a series of small missteps that had brought her to the edge of this abyss. And now she had nowhere to go but down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of orange and purple, Grace forced herself to step outside. She walked aimlessly, her arms wrapped protectively around her growing belly, as if to shield herself from the invisible wounds that had been inflicted upon her. The streets were alive with laughter, with conversations, with life moving forward, while she remained stuck in a past that refused to release its grip. She reached a small park, the benches empty, the air cool against her skin. She sat, her hands trembling as she placed them over her stomach, feeling the faint movements beneath. For the first time in weeks, tears spilled from her eyes, hot and unrelenting. She had been abandoned, humiliated, broken beyond what she thought was possible. But the life inside her, this child, was not to blame. And as much as she wanted to disappear, to erase the pain, she knew one thing with certainty. She had to find a way to survive, not for herself, but for the life she carried. Because no matter how deep her regret ran, she was no longer just Grace. She was a mother now, and mothers didn't get the luxury of giving up. The days stretched into weeks, and the weight of Grace's reality settled into something quieter, something less suffocating, but still ever-present. The world had not stopped for her heartbreak. Bills still arrived, her job still demanded her presence, and her body continued to change, a daily reminder that time moved forward whether she was ready or not. She had stopped waiting for Ease's calls. The initial shock of his betrayal had faded into something duller, an ache that no longer burned but throbbed beneath the surface, constant and unrelenting. Each morning she forced herself out of bed, dressed her body, and walked into a world that didn't know how much she had lost. At work, she answered emails, attended meetings, and smiled at the right moments, even as exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She no longer responded to questions about the father of her child. When people asked, she gave vague answers, letting them draw their own conclusions. The truth was too heavy to explain, and even if she could, what good would it do? No one could fix what had already been done. Nights were harder. Alone in her apartment, the silence became unbearable. There were moments when she would wake up gasping for air, her chest tight with the weight of everything she had lost. The darkness reminded her of Ease's voice, of the way he had laughed before delivering the final blow. Some nights, she whispered apologies to the child growing inside her, even though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. Herself? The baby? The girl she used to be, who had believed so blindly in love? But even as the grief threatened to consume her, something else stirred inside her, a quiet, stubborn resilience. She had been broken, yes, but she was still here. Her heart still beat. Her child still grew. And if she had to learn how to carry this pain, then so be it. She had survived every painful moment leading up to this one, and she would survive the ones to come. One evening, as she sat on the small balcony of her apartment, staring at the city lights below, she felt a shift inside her. The baby kicked stronger than before, almost as if to remind her that she wasn't truly alone. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she placed her hands over her belly, feeling the steady movement beneath her fingers. I am still here, she thought, and so are you. The realization settled deep within her, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in months. Ease was gone. The life she had imagined was gone. But this small, growing life was real. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The rain fell in slow, steady drops against the window pane, casting streaks of silver across the glass. Grace sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her hands resting protectively on her belly. It had been months since his final words shattered the illusion she had built around him, and though the pain still lingered, it no longer consumed her. There was no point in replaying the past, no point in wondering what she could have done differently. The truth was simple. Ease had never loved her the way she had loved him. And now, she had no choice but to accept it. The baby inside her stirred, a small but insistent reminder that her life was no longer just her own. She had spent so much time mourning what she had lost that she had barely allowed herself to think about what she had gained. This child, her child, was still a part of her, still waiting to enter the world, innocent and untouched by the mistakes that had led to its existence. Grace knew she couldn't remain trapped in her grief forever. There were decisions to make, preparations to be done. The baby would arrive in a matter of weeks, and she had yet to buy even the simplest necessities. The realization hit her all at once. She had been so consumed by her heartbreak that she had neglected the most important part of all, the future. With a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and searched for nearby baby stores. Just the thought of walking into one made her stomach twist, but she pushed the fear aside. She had spent too long drowning in regret. Now, she needed to start building something new. That afternoon, she forced herself out of the house, ignoring the weight of judgment she imagined in the eyes of strangers. She walked through the aisles of the store, running her fingers over tiny onesies, soft blankets, and stuffed animals. It felt surreal, picking out items for a baby she had once wished she didn't have. But as she placed her hands on her belly and felt the life inside her respond, something shifted. This baby was hers, no one else's. And no matter how it had come to be, she would love it with everything she had. That night, as she set up the crib in the corner of her bedroom, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. The pain had not vanished, nor had the memories of Ease's betrayal, but they no longer held the same power over her. She was more than what had happened to her, more than the choices she had made, more than the man who had abandoned her. She was Grace, a woman who had fallen, broken, and somehow found the strength to rise again. As she lay down, her body exhausted, but her mind lighter than it had been in months, she whispered into the quiet room, "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. The night was calm, the air heavy with the scent of rain that had passed earlier in the evening. Grace sat in the dim glow of her bedside lamp, her breathing measured, her hand gently rubbing the curve of her belly. The days had blurred into weeks, and now she was at the edge of a moment she had both feared and anticipated. Any day now, the child she had once doubted, once resented, would enter the world. She thought about all that had happened, the betrayal, the loneliness, the nights spent drowning in regret. It had been a storm, one that nearly pulled her under, but somehow she had found her way through. She had survived the heartbreak that once felt unbearable. And though the scars remained, they no longer dictated her future. Tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She traced circles over her belly, whispering soft words to the life within her. She no longer thought of what could have been. The past had lost its grip. What mattered now was the future, the one she would build, step by step, for the child who had become her reason to keep going. Labor came in the early hours of the morning, sudden and fierce. The pain tore through her like waves crashing against a fragile shore, each contraction pulling her closer to the reality that life was about to change forever. She had no one to call, no hand to hold, but she had long accepted that this was a road she would walk alone. At the hospital, the hours stretched, the pain intensifying, her body working through the motions of bringing forth the life she had once wished away. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it happened. A cry, sharp, piercing, alive. The sound shattered the silence that had once haunted her, replacing it with something raw, something new. They placed the baby in her arms, and for a moment everything else faded. The weight of the child against her chest, the warmth of soft skin, the tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers. It was overwhelming. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were not born of sorrow. She looked down at the tiny face, searching for traces of herself, of the unknown man whose role had ended the moment he walked away. But none of that mattered. This child was hers, a part of her, a symbol of all she had endured and all she had yet to become. In the quiet of the hospital room, as the city outside continued its endless motion, Grace made a promise. She would not let her past define her. She would not let betrayal dictate the way she loved. She had been abandoned, but she would never abandon this child. She would be enough, more than enough. As she held her baby close, she realized that love was not always the way she had imagined it to be. It was not the grand, sweeping romance she had once chased. Sometimes love was quiet. Sometimes it was choosing to wake up every morning and keep going, even when everything hurt. Sometimes it was holding on to something fragile and vowing to protect it with everything you had. And as she kissed the soft forehead of her newborn, she knew with certainty this was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.